Okay, so have you ever gone down one of those late night internet rabbit holes? You know, the ones where you find something so strange you just have to know if it's real. That's kind of where we are today. We're looking at this declassified reports from the U.S. Forest Service, and it was sent to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the title is, get this, Forest Fire as a Military Weapon. Weaponize wildfires, right? But this isn't some crazy conspiracy theory. It's an actual document from June 1970. It's got unclassified stamped all over it. And it's basically a feasibility study on, like, using forest fires tactically, especially in Southeast Asia. We're talking about analyzing fuel sources, like how to manipulate weather patterns, even using what they call desiccation treatments, basically to make jungles more flammable.
It's a fascinating look into the military mindset of the time.
Yeah, kind of unsettling too, though, right?
Yeah.
But before we get to the details, I think we need to address the elephant in the room here. I mean,
Oh,
this sounds like, I don't know, something out of a conspiracy theory blog or something.
it does sound like that, yeah. But I can assure you, this is a genuine government document.
Convince me.
Okay, so it's not just some blurry photocopy floating around the internet. This thing has all the hallmarks of an official document. It's got an AD number that's from the Defense Technical Information Center, where they keep all this kind of material. There are clear, unclassified stamps. It says exactly when and who declassified it, and even has instructions on who to contact if you want more information.
So it's not just the title that's attention grabbing, it's like the whole document screams authenticity.
Exactly. This wasn't just some random idea. The U.S. government, I mean, was seriously looking into this.
Which makes you wonder, right?
Yeah.
Why, like, what was the thinking behind exploring forest fires as a weapon?
Well, it's important to remember this report is a feasibility study. It's not like a declaration of war using fire or anything, but it does give us some insight into the strategic considerations of the time. I mean, think about it, right? You wouldn't waste resources researching something unless you're at least a little bit open to using it.
That's true. So even though it's labeled as just, a feasibility assessment, it speaks to some level of intent, or at least a willingness to consider the option.
Precisely. They were looking into whether they could do it, which, suggests they were at least thinking about if they should.
Okay, so let's unpack this feasibility assessment. Like, what did they actually look at?
Well, they were surprisingly thorough. They analyzed all these different types of fuel, grasses, shrubs, different types of forests, and how easily they ignite. They even categorized fuel loads by weight per square foot.
So, like, how much burnable stuff is in a given area? They were getting pretty specific.
Oh, yeah. They wanted to know what would burn best and where. It wasn't just about starting a fire. It was about predicting how intense and destructive it could be, based on what kind of fuel was there.
Makes sense. I mean, you can't just drop a match anywhere and expect a raging inferno.
Right. And that brings us to another crucial factor, the weather. The report really emphasizes the importance of ideal conditions for a successful forest fire, like analyzing temperature, humidity, wind, rainfall patterns. They actually they created a fire climate classification system, ranking regions based on, how susceptible they are to wildfires.
So they weren't just thinking about how to start fires. They were thinking about how those fires would behave and spread in different conditions.
Exactly. They were analyzing, like, entire ecosystems for their flammability potential.
And this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little disturbing, right? They actually looked into ways to artificially dry out vegetation to make it more likely to burn.
Like desiccation treatments?
Yeah, desiccation treatments. Okay, help me visualize this.
Yeah.
Like, what would that look like in practice?
Okay. Imagine you're flying over a jungle, right? Like a lush, vibrant jungle. And then you see these swaths of brown, dead foliage, like this stark contrast to the surrounding greenery. That's what a desiccation treatment would look like. They were essentially trying to turn parts of the jungle into a giant tinderbox.
And they considered different methods to do this.
Oh, yeah. Including chemical defoliants.
Like Agent Orange.
Yeah, among others. I mean, this was during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange was already being used. So they were basically brainstorming ways to, like, leverage that environmental impact, but for, military advantage.
So it wasn't just about starting fires. It was about manipulating the environment itself to turn it into a weapon.
Exactly. They were thinking about how to turn forests and jungles into tools of warfare. And, to refine that idea even further, they also looked at different ignition systems, like the best incendiary devices and techniques for maximizing a fire spread and intensity. They even they crunched the numbers on like spacing, timing, and the types of incendiaries best suited for different situations.
Wow. They really went all in on this. So we've established this report is authentic, and it seems to show at least some level of interest in, using forest fires as a weapon. But did they ever actually put these plans into action?
Well, that's what we'll get into next. The report actually mentions some specific operations where they tried to utilize forest fires in Vietnam. And
Wait, they actually tried this?
they did, and the results are pretty interesting. Yeah, they
All
did.
right.
The report, it mentions a couple of operations, Hot Tip and Pink Rose. Both of them involved trying to use forest fires in Vietnam.
Okay. Tell me more. What were they hoping to accomplish with these operations?
Well, to understand that, we got to think about the Vietnam War itself. It was unlike any other war the U.S. had fought before.
Yeah, right. Jungle warfare, guerrilla tactics,
Right.
an enemy that, knew the terrain like the back of their hand.
Exactly. The Viet Cong, they relied on the dense jungle for cover, ambushes. They even set up bases in there. They were practically invisible in that terrain.
Which made them really hard to target using, normal military tactics.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of using forest fires came in.
So they were thinking, deny the enemy their sanctuary.
Basically, yeah. They figured if they could burn away the vegetation, they could take away the Viet Cong's cover,
Yeah.
expose their movements, and disrupt their operations.
Sounds pretty straightforward in theory. But how did it actually work out in practice?
Well, let's see. Operation HOTTP, that was in 1965. They targeted a 21 square kilometer area. They believed it was a Viet Cong stronghold. And intelligence reports after the operation said there were 200 Viet Cong casualties out of an estimated 2,000 in the whole area.
That's significant, I guess. But not exactly like a knockout blow.
Right. And it seems like the effectiveness was pretty limited because only about 17% of the targeted area actually burned intensely enough to create the kind of widespread fire they were hoping for.
Which I guess kind of shows how unpredictable fire can be, even with all that careful planning.
Oh, absolutely. And that unpredictability, it became even more obvious in Operation Pink Rose. That one was in early 1967.
Okay, what happened there?
Well, Pink Rose involved 3 big tests. They targeted war zones C and D.
Yeah.
Basically, they wanted to see if they could effectively ignite and control forest fires in those areas.
So it sounds like they were, trying to get better at it based on what they learned from Hat Tip.
Yeah, they were. But the results, according to the report anyway, weren't any better. And based on those outcomes, the Forest Service actually recommended against doing any more operational testing in Vietnam.
So even though they had this whole plan for weaponized forest fires, they decided it just wasn't practical.
Seems like it, yeah. The report doesn't, explicitly say why. But it was probably a combination of things, right? The unpredictability of fire, how hard it is to control where it spreads, and maybe even some concerns about the potential consequences.
Yeah, we really talked about, the ethical implications of intentionally starting huge forest fires.
True. But before we get to that, there's another interesting case study that the report analyzes. The U Minh forest fires of 1968.
Oh, yeah, right. Those are the ones that were initially blamed on the Viet Cong, weren't they?
They were, and that's exactly why they caught the attention of the Forest Service. Remember, they had just said they didn't want to do any more testing of weaponized forest fires, and then boom, you have this massive firestorm ripping through a known Viet Cong stronghold.
So they had to investigate. Was it just a coincidence? Or had the Viet Cong figured out how to do what the U.S. couldn't?
Right. Well, the report has a whole appendix dedicated to analyzing the U Minh forest fires. They looked at aerial photographs, weather data, intelligence reports, trying to piece together what happened.
What did they figure out?
Their analysis showed that the U Minh forest fires were mostly accidental.
Seriously?
Yeah, seems so. While there were a few cases of fires being deliberately set by both the U.S. and the Viet Cong, most of the burning was caused by a combination of things, like really dry conditions and accidental ignitions. Things like artillery strikes, drop flares, even discarded cigarette butts could spark fires that would then spread out of control.
So this massive firestorm, which everyone thought, like, proved that weaponized forest fires could work. It was actually just a bunch of unintended consequences.
Exactly. It really highlights the inherent risks
Yeah.
and unpredictability of using fire as a weapon, even in a place like the human forest, which, according to their own criteria, was like perfect for this kind of operation.
That's fascinating and a little scary, honestly.
It does make you think.
For sure. So we've talked about fuel, weather, ignition systems. We've even looked at some real-world attempts to use forest fires in Vietnam. But there's still a big piece missing, right?
Yeah.
Like the ethical considerations of all this.
You're right. This report, I mean, it's fascinating from a scientific and strategic perspective, but it definitely raises some serious ethical questions about warfare and our relationship with the environment.
I mean, we're talking about intentionally setting fires. That could have, like, devastating long-term consequences.
Precisely. And that's where the conversation shifts from the technical to the philosophical.
Yeah, I mean, you could talk about denying enemy cover or whatever, but forest fires, they don't just, like, stop at enemy lines, right? They affect everything and everyone they touch.
Exactly. That's one of the biggest ethical concerns, right? You can't just contain a wildfire to, enemy combatants, civilians, wildlife, whole ecosystems. They're all going to be affected.
Yeah, and the long-term damage, like
Mhm.
deforestation, soil erosion, the air pollution.
Yeah.
That's not something you can just, fix with a treaty.
Right. The environmental consequences, they can last for generations.
It's interesting, though. The report itself doesn't really seem to care about any of that.
You're right. It's a pretty big omission considering how much destruction we're talking about.
I guess we got to remember that this was written in 1970, right? Back
Hmm.
then, environmental awareness wasn't exactly, a big thing.
True. But even then, there were people raising concerns about the use of defoliants like Agent Orange. So the idea of intentionally setting huge forest fires would definitely have been controversial, at least among people who understood, the potential damage.
So what we have here is this document. It's like a product of its time, for sure. But it also gives us a glimpse into a certain way of thinking. And it raises some pretty timeless questions about the limits of warfare,
Yeah.
the unintended consequences of, our action,
Right.
and our responsibility to protect the environment.
I think that's a really important takeaway from this whole deep dive. This report isn't just like some weird historical footnote. It's a reminder that the decisions we make, especially when it comes to war, they can have a huge and lasting impact on the world around us.
Yeah, no doubt. It's definitely a sobering thought. But it also, like, highlights the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Questioning assumptions.
Yeah.
And really thinking things through before we do anything that could, mess with the forces of nature.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to leave our listeners with something to, think about. We started with this bizarre document about weaponized forest fires. We talked about the science behind it, the strategy, the historical context, and we even touched on some of the ethical dilemmas it raises.
It's a lot to process.
It is. And at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to, grapple with those complexities, weigh the potential benefits against the risks, and decide where we draw the line.
Some serious food for thought.
For sure. And until next time, keep diving deep.